What you doing?
Frankie gibbered excitedly. The stranger looked down at my son with a cold sneer, then up at me. I gave him an apologetic smile and took hold of my boy's hand.
Frankie, it's not nice to bother strangers on the train.
I reminded him exhaustedly as I pulled him closer.
Why?
Frankie asked me. I sighed, then wondered how his mother handled the constant barrage of questions. I then immediately cursed myself for even thinking it. After all, I only had my son on the weekends. Shouldn't I enjoy every moment of it? Not that I didn't. He was just 5 now, and the number of questions was getting unbearable. But that was the sign of a curious mind. At least, that's what I tiredly reminded myself.
Because it's not nice,
I answered his question firmly.
People might be doing other things on the train, and you're interrupting them. Now, be quiet, or we won't go to Nando's for dinner.
For a second, that kept him quiet, with only the rattling of the train filling the air. He was young and rambunctious, but he was old enough to know that I meant my warning. It wouldn't be the first time he found himself eating his mother's vegetarian whole wheat or quinoa shite instead of peri-peri chicken at Nando's after bad behavior. I watched Frankie turn around, stand on the chair and start looking out the window. He probably shouldn't have been standing on the seat, but I had to pick my battles. I went back to my phone for just a second of peace and quiet, but my news app isn't much calmer. The article screamed at me. Another body found mauled in local woods. Police warn people to keep out of the forest until the beast is caught.
What you doing?
My son asked in the distance. I sighed, then looked around. My son's voice carried, as many young children's tend to do, and it took me a surprisingly long time to find him. He was at least 2 carriages down from me, bugging yet another stranger. I pocketed my phone and began to hurry over to him at a light jog. The man he was talking to was a strange specimen, tall, but unproportionately so. Like his arms were too long for his body, and his legs were far too short. He wore an obfuscating coat. His collar was up, covering half his face. It went all the way down to his ankles. It was completely zipped up, and he wore a beanie on top of that. That made the pink, sparkling music box he held in his hands even more bizarre. It was so stark in its color, how cheerful and sparkling it was compared to the almost noir detective-looking figure. The man leaned down and murmured something to my son that I couldn't hear. Then, Frankie's voice chirped back.
Yeah!
I didn't know why, but my skin was crawling. I started jogging faster. Then, the man opened up the music box in front of Frankie. I assumed it was a music box, and the little ballerina danced inside the box, but I couldn't hear anything. I got closer, and the man looked up at me. He snapped the box shut, staring at me.
Hey,
I said, somewhat curtly.
Sorry he bothered you. My son likes to ask questions.
The stranger just stared at me. I leaned down and took Frankie's hand. It was shaking.
Come on, Frankie. I told you not to bother strangers.
That was when my son looked up at me.
I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry.
His face was ghost white. His eyes were filled with tears. I felt myself frown. I looked up at the stranger again, and he was already off in the distance, pushing past people in the train to get further away. Frankie started crying next to me, and I got down on one knee and scooped him up into my arms.
Hey,
I murmured to him.
What's wrong, champ? What's going on? Hey.
I bobbed him up and down, but he was sobbing too hard. So I just tucked him into my arms. Frankie sat on my lap for the rest of the train journey. Later that Sunday evening, I knocked on my ex's door. Frankie's mother opened it with her usual resting bitch face, but her eyes widened when she looked down at Frankie. She leaned down to be face level with Frankie.
What's wrong, sweetheart?
Frankie just shook his head and then looked up at his mom.
Can I go to bed?
He asked her. Her eyes widened. She didn't know what to say for a long second, and then she murmured,
Sure. If you want to, sweetie.
Frankie then walked past his mother and into the house. She turned, moving her burning eyes on me.
What did you do?
Oh, it's my fault, is it? I snapped in response. Not even a second to explain before you're pinning it on me, huh? She huffed, and I tried to swallow down the bitter memories of our relationship and answer in a calmer tone. He was talking to strangers on the train, and a man had a birthday present or a music box, and I think there was something in there that scared him. What was it? She asked, unimpressed. I don't know, but it was probably just something horror movie related he shouldn't have seen. You didn't stop Frankie from talking to strangers? She snapped. I groaned. I couldn't do another argument with my ex, especially standing on her front porch. I just turned and started walking away. Just keep an eye on him. He's just a little spooked. He'll be fine. I grunt over my shoulder. You've been showing him horror movies again. I just know you have. She yelled at me. I ignored her and headed back to my car to get home. The next weekend, I had to come back. I was somewhat dreading it. I knew she wouldn't forget that I walked away from her, and she wouldn't forgive me either. She was petty like that. When I knocked on the door, however, her new husband, Steve, was the one who opened it. When he saw me, his eyes widened. Joe, what are you doing here? I'm here to pick up Frankie. What do you mean? I asked. Didn't you get our voicemail? Frankie's in the hospital. Lucy's with him. My stomach dropped. I stared at Steve, unblinking. Is he okay? We don't know. You'd better get over there. I barreled into the hospital car park and sprinted over to the room. I saw my ex outside the room. Her arms were clutching her own elbows. What's happening? I nearly shouted at her. What's wrong with Frankie? She glared up at me from the corner of her eye, but she gave a tearful sigh and answered me quietly.
They don't know. He just hasn't eaten since Monday.
A chill ran through my blood.
He hasn't? No. I gave him breakfast, and he threw a tantrum about eating it. Then I got a call from his teacher that he wasn't eating his lunch at school and he was acting weird. I tried to make him eat his dinner, and it looked like he had.
She sighed and hugged herself tighter.
And it carried on like that. He waited at the table until Steve and I had to go back to our other chores. Then he'd eat, or eat, as it turned out, because I found his dinners in Tupperware boxes under his bed. I found those on Friday, and I took him to the doctor's.
My ex looked up at me tearfully.
I should have known, but he's never had a problem eating before. He's always been the opposite. It's so unlike him.
I sank down a little.
Yeah, he didn't want to eat at Nando's after the train.
My ex glares at me.
When were you planning on telling me this? I thought he was just spooked by the man on the train. I didn't know he'd carry on. Besides, why did you wait a whole week before taking him to the hospital? I told you, I didn't...
But my ex showed uncharacteristic restraint. She took a single breath and lowered her voice to a growl.
I don't want to start a screaming match now. Frankie can hear us.
My heart sank down in my chest.
Right,
I agreed.
It's about Frankie. Can I go in and see him?
She looked over her shoulder at the hospital room.
Maybe. He's going in for a scan soon, but you might have a minute if you go in right now.
I swallowed hard and nodded. My feet dragged across the floor as I walked towards the hospital doorway. The environment seemed to darken around the doorway. My heart was lodged somewhere in my throat. All the commotion of the hospital died down. All I could hear was my own heartbeat ricocheting around my skull. When I walked into the hospital room, the first thing I could see was a skeleton in the bed. It was only when I blinked harder that the skin on those bones became visible. The eyeballs sunken into the skull were staring beadily at me. He was ghost white, and his thick locks of brown hair had been thinned into single straggly strands. I hated to admit it, but my body wanted to flee. My instincts didn't recognize Frankie as a human being anymore. I bit the inside of my cheek to force my horrified scream back down. I rushed over to the bedside and fell to my knees, face to face with what my son now was.
Oh, Frankie.
Those eyes, so shrunken, rolled around in the head to face me.
Dad. Frankie, what happened? Please, what's going on, champ?
Frankie smiled weakly.
I'm hungry,
he murmured back. A wave of sorrow rose in my chest, and I dropped my head with a small, sad chuckle.
Well, yeah.
I met Frankie's gaze again.
Why haven't you been eating, champ? Please. Your mother said you haven't eaten for a week.
Frankie averted his gaze from me and shrugged moodily.
Frank,
I snapped.
please, talk to me.
He didn't, and I knew I had to broach the subject.
It was that man on the train, wasn't it?
Frankie flinched when I said it.
Is that why you haven't been eating?
His large, innocent eyes moved back over to me.
Frankie, please,
I begged.
what was in the music box? What made you stop eating?
Those huge, yet shrunken orbs observed me closely. Those little cracked lips opened lightly. I leaned forwards.
I don't know, Dad,
He whispered. The first thing that hit me was a wave of irritation, but when I looked into those eyes, I believed him. Whatever was in there, he really didn't know what it was.
Excuse me, sir.
A nurse said to me.
He needs to go in for his scan now.
I sighed.
Fine.
I forced a smile for Frankie.
I'll see you later, Frankie.
I assured him.
I'll come see you tomorrow.
He looked at me. There was so much fear shining in those eyes. He was hustled onto a wheelchair and taken away. As soon as I stepped outside, my ex was still standing there, arms folded. For a second, I considered telling her, but she'd blame me, and it would lead to another fiery confrontation. I knew it. So instead, I just nodded respectfully and walked away. The next day, it hadn't even reached 3 a.m. before my cell phone started ringing. I sleepily reached for it, shocked into wakefulness.
Hello?
Have you seen Frankie?
My ex shrieked on the other end. I covered my ringing ear and sat up.
What?
Frankie!
She snapped.
He ran away from the hospital after his scan last night. Did you take him home? Have you seen him?
What?
I asked, sleepiness now fully gone.
No! How does a boy that malnourished escape from the hospital?
I don't know. He was on the 3rd floor. Have you seen him?
I just said no.
I snapped back.
Fine. Tell me if you've seen him.
She hung up as quickly as she called. For a second, I laid in bed. My heart raced in my chest, and my veins squeezed from how fast my blood was coursing through me. I was already panting. But what can I do? I didn't know where Frankie would go, or where his hangouts were, or where my ex happened to be looking. I didn't know what his hobbies were, or who his friends were, or who he would choose to go to if he ran away. The only place I'd think to look would be here, my house. If I got up and started searching now, I'd be looking blind. I don't know my own son. The realization was painful, but the fact was that my ex and the police would do a better job looking for him than I ever could, since I wouldn't even know where to start. And I had work in 3 hours. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up, went downstairs, and sat on the couch on the sofa, right next to the front door. I faced the front door and waited in case Frankie came to see me. An hour passed, and I decided to go to bed. A bolt of agony, scalding and wet, crashed through my arm. I was screaming before I was even awake. When I opened my eyes, a stark white skeleton stood over me, eyes burning as they looked at me. Their hands were dark, and there was red dripping off them. My eyes snapped down to the pain. My bicep was cleaved open. A thick fillet of flesh was flapping off my arm. The glistening muscle opened to the air. Red flooded everywhere. A kitchen knife was lodged in my bicep. Its handle was held by the gremlin standing over me. As I watched, the figure's bloody hand darted towards the flap of flesh it butchered off me. It grabbed it and ripped it off my arm. Another shot of pain coursed through me. I screamed. I clutched my arm, blood squeezing through my fingers. I forced my eyes open, and the figure stepped backwards, the flap of my arm in its mouth, devouring the slab of flesh. Blood dripped down off its chin.
What the hell are you?
I demanded, standing up. The little Wendigo creature stepped backwards and crossed a beam of moonlight coming in through the window. I froze as I saw it clearly.
Frankie!
Frankie's sunken eyes looked at me ashamedly. He licked the blood off his lips, still staring at me like a kicked puppy.
What the?
I'm sorry, Dad.
He whimpered.
I thought you wouldn't be mad at me.
I just stared at him. Frankie suddenly leapt and disappeared. I looked around until I heard a light scrunching above my head, and I looked. He was crawling across the ceiling like a spider. His long, straggly limbs reached and clawed as he scurried across.
Frankie! Frankie, wait!
He slid out the window and escaped. I started running and went to my front door. I whipped it open and saw Frankie's spindly, ghost-white form land on the ground and start running towards the forest on all fours.
Frankie!
I sprinted after him. I knew I was at a disadvantage in the woods. There were too many places for whatever Frankie had become to climb and hide. But he was my son. I saw him immediately, crouched in a grove between the trees, spotlighted by the moonlight.
Frankie!
I called.
I'm sorry, Dad. Please don't be mad. I'm not.
I said, getting closer.
Just please, tell me what's going on.
You need to talk to Master.
Frankie answered. I went completely cold.
Who's Master?
I am. A new voice joined us. Then the man from the train, complete with the obfuscating coat and hat, as well as the little pink box, walked out.
You!
I snarled. Let's not waste time, the man with the music box said. You have two choices from here on out. You can either look into the box, learn the truth, and join your son, or... Before he could speak, several murmuring voices rang out in the forest around me. My eyes snapped up. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of bright white, skeletal creatures, all skin and bones and burning eyes, staring at me, hungrily. I nodded for a moment and then started bolting towards the man.
Give me back my son!
The man didn't move. When I grabbed at him, the coat tore off him. His face was barely existent, and his hands were the only solid thing. He was scaled above the waist, but below the waist was coarse black fur. He had hooves. He had tendrils around the waist, which snapped around me and held me there. There were eyeballs in the hips, rolling around to face me. The box was shoved into my face, and he opened the lid. Inside was everything. Everything large and small. The world of microbes running in circular patterns, all the way up to stars, forming, unforming, birthing, growing, collapsing in, and becoming black holes. I saw humans live and die. I saw the planet living, dying, and reforming in the universe. The only stationary aspect was the beast in the box, mottled and squirming flesh, eyes forming and unforming. Its existence was the only constant in the world, and all those eyes were fixed on me. As they did, my unconscious unwound. It unraveled. It unspooled itself in front of me. I was floating. I was sinking. I was non-existent and so real at once. My body was a horrible beating, pulsing, pumping, squishing entity, unworthy of the beast before me. My God. My mind was not big enough. I knew everything for a long moment, and then I knew nothing. I barely was myself anymore. I vaguely remembered it, but on the whole, I was empty. Except for one thing. Except for one certainty. One sure thing. One thing that I knew with every fiber of my being. I'm hungry. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.